Well, to say goodbye properly, we are so pleased to bring out Jacqueline. She's the author of 18 novels in the award-winning New York Times national and international best-selling series featuring psychologist investigator Maisie Dobbs. In addition, she's written non-series novels, The White Lady, and it was a New York Times and national bestseller. And her 2014 World War I novel, The Care and Management of Lies, was again a New York Times and national bestseller. She's also a Dayton Literary Peace Prize finalist, and she's published 2 nonfiction books, What Would Maisie Do? And an Edgar-nominated memoir. This time next year, we'll be laughing. So please give a warm welcome to Ojai's own Jacqueline Winspear. So before we have Jacqueline talk, I just want to shout out about The Comfort of Ghosts. It's got tons of accolades. We're talking the Washington Post's top historical novel of the year, New York Times bestseller, a USA Today bestseller, an American Bookseller Association Indie bestseller, go Indie, an Amazon Best Book of the Year, I guess I should have omitted that one, the Boston Globe Best Books of Summer, and BookBub's Best Historical Fiction of Summer. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Kirkus Review calls it a fitting finale to a marvelously entertaining series full of finely drawn characters often scarred by the horrors of war. And to bring it all out of her, we're so pleased to bring out Santa Barbara local. He's the author of the Solomon and Lord and Jake Lasseter novels. We have a couple Jake Lasseters behind our counter over there, and including his latest, which is Early Grave, which is also behind our counter. Paul Levine has won the John D. McDonald Fiction Award and has been nominated for the Edgar McCavity International Thriller, Shamus, and James Thurber prizes. So he's a very honored writer, but he's also wrote 20 episodes of the CBS military drama JAG, which was one of my late father's favorite shows. And he co-created the Supreme Court show First Monday, starring James Garner and Joe Mantegna. His forthcoming novel, which I'm really excited about, Midnight Burning. It's coming out in 2025. It's the first of a series of thrillers featuring real-life friends and 2 of my favorite historical figures, Albert Einstein and Charlie Chaplin. Please welcome Paul Levine.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Jackie.
We used to be blog mates. There used to be a great blog, it was a great blog, Naked Authors, and there was a group of us that wrote every week, and Paul and I,
We've known each other a long time.
We've known each other a while.
So we can be
we
casual.
go back.
There are 2 ways we can do this.
Uh-oh.
Do you remember the show on Bravo, Actors Studio, with James
I
Lipton
do,
doing
yeah.
interviews?
Yeah.
He would have like 300 blue note cards. And
Yeah.
something happened in 3rd grade. What? No, we're not going to do that tonight.
Yeah.
We're going to do the Larry King. Everybody remember Larry King?
I was actually worried about your favourite sort of bad word.
Oh.
That one that he used to ask.
We're going to do a conversation. I do have some notes. I don't have 300 note cards. But let's talk about the beginning of Maisie Dobbs, the many lives of Maisie
The many
Dobbs.
lives of
Oh
Maisie
my
Dobbs.
goodness. You'll fill in where I leave out and then I'll ask the question. A maid in a rich person's house at age 13, a nurse in World War I, a university student, a psychologist, an investigator doing work privately and for the government, sort of, a wife, a widow, a wife again. Am I missing anything here?
No, but it would not have been unusual.
So where did she come from? What was the inspiration for Maisie Dobbs?
Well, that's a really good question, because before I wrote Maisie Dobbs, I had a day job Actually, I had 2 day jobs. I come from a long line of people that are not happy with just one job. They always think you're going to lose it. And I was also writing non-fiction. And I didn't think I could write fiction, actually, because I didn't think I could tell a story. I loved interviewing people. I loved writing articles and essays. My literary love was the personal essay, memoir. And it was while I was on my way to work, stuck in really horrible traffic, you know, stoplights, tail lights, and me stuck. And I confess I'm a bit of a dreamer, daydreamer. And that's roughly when Maisie Dobbs walked into my life.
Just appeared.
Just
a daydream.
Well, you know, the daydream usually starts off with, did I turn off the stove? Did I leave the door open for the dog to get out? Did I? And then, but literally, it was like watching a movie. This woman walked up through Warren Street Station in London. I knew it was Warren Street because I used that station every day when I worked in Fitzroy Square. But it wasn't the sort of heavy stainless steel escalator that you might have seen in London. It was the old-fashioned wooden clunkety clunk, clunkety clunk, clunkety clunk. None of these machines that sort of grab you and then grab the tick card or no tap and go. It was the old turnstile. She came out, I mean, literally, there I am watching this. She came out, she stopped to talk to a news vendor, she bought a newspaper, she walked down the street.
Thank you.
She stood outside a Georgian building, took out an envelope, and there were 2 keys in the envelope. I knew her name, I knew almost everything about her. And that was roughly when I heard a guy shouting, "Are you waiting for any particular shade of green, lady?"
So basically, Jackie, you had a hallucination.
I had a hallucination.
Yes. But
yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong. The first book, cleverly titled Maisie Dobbs,
Yeah.
the first sentence of the first book, she is walking through the turnstile in that station, but we're in the point of view of a man looking at her,
Yes.
who notices she's tall, slender, and has a well-turned ankle.
That's a very old phrase, and you know, particularly when women were wearing longer skirts, you know, the well-turned ankle was what people noticed, and
Very hot, very,
no,
very
it was hot. And you know, he would notice something like that. But you know, we've spoke about this earlier, but I've always referred to that moment as a moment of artistic grace, because by the time I got to work, I pretty much had most of the story in my head, and I don't think those moments of artistic grace happen in a vacuum, because I'd always been interested in the history, particularly of not only of the world wars, but that generation of women in Britain.
And because things don't just pop into your head, you had parents and grandparents who had very precise memories of World War II and before.
Mm-hmm.
When Michael read the excerpt from Kirkus Reviews, it ended with, "in the horrors of war." Can you elaborate on what, I don't want to say messages because you're not sending messages, but what do you want your readers to take away from all of those horrors of war, both to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and to the people at home?
I think it's really the impact on people. And I recently wrote a piece which I put on my Facebook page, and it was and I posted on November the 11th. And November the 11th, what my grandmother would have called Armistice Day, Remembrance Day through most of the Commonwealth countries, and here it is, of course, Veterans Day. But in Britain, if you're in Britain on that day at 11 o'clock in the morning, probably most of the buses will stop. A lot of people will stop in the street. They'll all be wearing their poppies, and there's a real sense of lest we forget. And one thing that I think, oh gosh, this is so hard to say, is that I don't think, and I had this sense from childhood, I don't think dates really work for veterans. And let me explain what I mean by that. My grandfather was severely wounded at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. He was shell-shocked and gassed, and he received horrible leg wounds. He was still removing splinters of shrapnel from his legs when he died at the age of 77 in 1966. You know, I think of someone like my grandmother. She was wounded in an explosion at the munitions factory, the Woolwich Arsenal in London. 17, 18 years old, and she was partially blinded. And that, it never stopped her reading a book though. And but her war didn't end in 1918. My grandfather's war didn't end in 1918. My mother's war definitely didn't end in 1945. She was evacuated away from home, and I remember 24 hours before she died at the age of 88, I was holding her when she was literally weeping, saying, why did she send us away? Why did she send us away? Because she and her sisters, and if she was here, I would never reveal this, but they were sent to the home of someone we might today refer to as a paedophile. In those days, it was a man who interfered with little girls. So, and the other thing, Paul, is that you know, during my research, and one of the things I've concentrated on is the particularly the impact of war on children, in the more later books. And kick me if I'm going on.
No,
but
go on, please.
I read this terrific book by a guy called Martin Parsons. It's called War Child. He was the director of the Institute for the Study of War Child at Reading University. And they looked at the experiences of not only former evacuees from the UK, but they looked at boy soldiers in other countries in Africa, and just all manner of what does that experience do to you. And one of the things they found was that an experience of war, particularly in childhood, takes three generations to go through the family system. So that means that someone who's maybe parent is coming home from a war zone, they're experiencing war because they're seeing those wounds, psychological wounds perhaps in their parent. My father, for example, was raised in a very quiet house because, like a lot of veterans from different wars, the sound really is a trigger. And so my dad was raised in a quiet house, and I can't imagine how he felt at 18 when he became an explosives expert in the Second World War at 18 years old, because they thought, oh, well, he's calm, you know, calm under pressure, and
He doesn't have children and a wife.
Exactly.
So
So I was actually raised in a house that, you know, I mean, my mum and dad were great, you know, they loved it. They were near a swing band, but it was a pretty quiet house in many ways.
Well, you've hit on a couple of themes that I'm
Okay.
drawing from the book.
Okay.
And one of them is that the war doesn't end. And you have Maisie in The Comfort of Ghost quote a line from The Great Gatsby, that we are born, B-O-R-N-E, we are born ceaselessly into the past.
Yeah.
Which also evokes the famous Faulkner line, the past is never dead, it's not even past. Maisie is scarred. She's lost a husband. She's seen brutality and the horrors of war. The women on the home front, everything from surplus women, in fact, tell us what surplus women.
Okay. And that's really, I suppose, where Maisie Dobbs came from, because of my interest in that generation of women they were the first generation of women who went to war in modern times. These were the women of Britain. So I'm talking about the First World War. Pre-1914, there were probably, say, you know, leading up to the First World War, maybe 1.5 million women who were working. But they were mostly invisible. They worked in factories, they took in washing, they looked after other people's kit, and there were a few women who worked with that newfangled thing, a typewriter. But mostly, you know, women at that era, you expected your life to be very much like your mother's or your grandmother's life before you. You were under your father's roof easily until you were either married or you were 21 years of age, which was the age of, as we say in Britain, the age of consent. But it changed everything, because during the First World War, as more men were being sent to the front, more men were being killed, young men of marriageable age, so women were being drafted into the workplace. And I'm not just in war work, although nurses went to the Western Front, to other fronts, excuse me, as nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers. thousands of women, believe it or not, worked just across the channel in France, in Le Havre, as postal workers, which is how you managed to get a letter from England to your son in the trenches within 2 days. Because you had all these women working, getting the mail out, getting the packages out, and so on. There was not a field of endeavor left untouched by a woman's hand. They did everything from building to shipbuilding, building aircraft. Oh my gosh,
Those
it was
munitions factories
the
that would
munitions
blow up now
factories
and
that
then.
would blow up. They buried the dead. They delivered the milk. They did everything.
But then after the
And
war,
then after the war,
yes,
the 1921, so you're moving me along, the 1921 census revealed that there were 2 million surplus women for whom there would never be a husband and children. And that is you can easily get that if you look at the numbers of dead, the numbers of very, very seriously wounded and profoundly shell-shocked. In fact, the last shell-shocked man from World War I died in what was, I think the fancy name at the time was something like memory care, but when he first went in, it was an asylum. It became a psychiatric hospital, a mental hospital, and then, memory care. And he died in 1994. He had been there since he came home in 1917. And so, but those women, they blazed a trail, and they were extraordinary. There were too many of them, and they knew pretty soon I'm going to have to, be responsible for my financial security for the rest of my life. I'm going to have to build communities and partnership so that I can be sustained as I grow older. And obviously there were those that lived lonely lives, but many of them just blazed a trail. As I always say, it's the great age of the British woman novelist. I mean, there's a job you can do at home with no training. I know.
one of the things I love about your novels is I'm always learning stuff. What you were just talking about. I was going to compliment you on your research, but that would be like complimenting a carpenter on driving a nail straight. You write historical fiction, of course you research. You may not remember this, but you told me once, research is like an iceberg. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, when you're using your research as a writer, it should be like an iceberg. Only 7% of it visible above the surface. You have to trust that everything you've learned will inform every single word. And I, sometimes have in the past have mentored beginning novelists, and there's very often, there's this thing, I have learned all this stuff, therefore I have got to get it in. And you have to trust that your research, that which you find out, that which you discover, the little ahas, it's you're flavoring a soup, you're flavoring a dish, and so you just have to trust that it's there. It's the knowledge is there, but the obvious bits, only 7% of it.
Don't dump truck it in.
Don't dump truck it in. That's really, I'm going to remember that one now. I'm going to write that down quick.
You visited battlefields.
I have.
You visited the Imperial War Museum probably more times than anyone else in history.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to say that no historian, not talking about historical fiction, no historian knows more about Great Britain 1929 to 1945 than you do. And I'm going to go further, and I'm going to say that what you do is harder, because they gather all this, and they do dump. That's their job.
Yeah.
Usually chronologically, it's not that hard once they do the research. You do the research to inform your characters and create a story. One of the things I learned in The Comfort of Ghosts, among many things, auxiliary units.
Yeah.
What were auxiliary units? I found it fascinating.
Auxiliary units, it is really interesting. When there was a very strong belief that Britain would be invaded very quickly after declaring war on Germany. I mean, they were already in France, and it's not that far away. I mean, we used to go over there on the hovercraft when I was a kid to Calais for the day. You're over there in half an hour. They didn't have hovercraft, but they could get over. And so it was we know about the men and women that had undercover roles in France. They were sent into France and so on, but very few people know about the homegrown auxiliary units. The county of Kent, where I'm from, was actually it used to be called Bomb Alley, because that's where the bombers went over, and it was
where they dumped the bombs that they didn't
they had dumped
drop
them
on
on.
London.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They'd also do that, and there was a belief that that we would need units, civilian units, to combat the invaders. So literally all sorts of ordinary people were recruited, from teenagers to the local vicar, although we understand you don't want to kill anybody, but then they were trained in hand-to-hand combat. They were trained in intelligence gathering, sabotage, and if necessary, assassination. And the person who was put in charge of literally spearheading this, gathering people together, sending out the officers in different villages, was actually a man called Peter Fleming, who was Ian Fleming's brother. And there was a very large sort of stately home in Kent called the Garth. That was their headquarters. I first came across this when I was reading, and it was because it only started to come out a few years ago, about this man who probably my age, and he was recounting something that happened when he was 8 or 9 years old. And you used to get a lot of door-to-door salesmen, knock on the door trying to sell encyclopedias or whatever, cleaning fluid. And it was really interesting because you could just imagine this happening. Guy comes to the door, mum goes to the door and says, "Sorry, not interested." And he said the salesman stuck his foot in the door and wouldn't let her close it. He said, "I don't really know what happened, but the next thing, the man was flying through the air, crash landed on the path, and ran off, terrified." And his mum just, closed the door. And he said, "What did you just do?" "Nothing." And it was only when she was elderly, she told him, "I was doing what I was trained to do when I was a kid." She was really well versed in hand-to-hand combat. And she took it out on a door-to-door salesman. But that's what the units were. And
Which you used in Comfort of Ghost.
I
You
used
that incident.
And actually, to your point about being a historian and so on and so forth, I think there's one thing I'd like to say about that, if I may, and that is that when I started really getting my work published, I concentrated on non-fiction because I thought I was dealing with what is so, and there was something solid about that. And I call this naivete for someone who studied English literature and so on. But it was only when I started writing fiction and Maisie Dobbs, I realized you can touch truth more readily with fiction than you can ever do with fact.
As Ernest Hemingway believed also.
I
Write
didn't know
something
that,
that is
but
true.
yes.
Write something that is true.
Yeah.
So we should be talking about the Comfort of Ghost, I guess.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
here,
let's do that.
And the segue is you have 4 young people who are in or just out of an auxiliary unit. The book takes place in 1945,
Yeah.
after the war ended.
Yeah.
But they are. I'm not gonna say. You tell us. Tell us
Well,
about
I don't want to
this.
give out too much away, but they they actually were all children for whom there was no one else. So they were in a children's home, and they have observed something. They have seen something that they probably shouldn't have seen, and because they saw something which that happened, there's something that happened. They go to see the person who had been their main point of contact when they were, recruited into auxiliary units. And then let's just say they know they go into hiding. They are given leave to go into hiding by one of the most senior people, and they end up in a Belgravia mansion, which just happens to be the sort of not abandoned, but abandoned temporarily, Belgravia mansion that is the home of Maisie's now friend, but was her sponsor, the Lord and Lady Compton. And it's interesting because in London at that time, It really came to a head in 1946. There were a lot of people homeless in Britain. This is the plague down estimate. 250,000 people were absolutely completely homeless.
Because their homes had been destroyed.
Because they're
and
completely
otherwise,
destroyed.
yes.
So what did they do? There were
Squatters.
They became squatters,
Yes.
and a lot of them went to the American bases that were being abandoned.
Yeah.
And if you read The White Lady, you will also know that when those bases were abandoned, just as an aside, the Americans left behind food, they left behind blankets, and they also left behind a lot of weapons which fell into the wrong hands.
And motorcycles, I think you said at some point. Yes.
Yes, there were Harley Davidsons in particular buried. I remember when my brother read that in a local paper. He was about 17 at the time, and off he went with my mother's metal detector because she was going through a bit of a phase with that, because he was convinced he was going to come home with a Harley, and he didn't.
I think a lot of people with metal detectors actually found bombs that had not exploded.
Yeah.
Over
And
the
they're
years.
still finding them.
They're still
And in fact, when
finding
I went to, go on.
let me ask you a tough question.
Uh-oh.
Because you're here in the United States. Are you an American citizen?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Would you agree with me
Uh-oh.
that Americans are really uninformed about Europe, about England, about the Blitz, about what life was like that you have described over 21 years in all of these books?
What I would say is that I have many emails, many letters from people saying, I didn't know it was like that. There's actually just been a book published, I haven't read it yet, though I bought it, about literally the impact of war films on America, and how people have their information from movies rather than what really happened. And there is such a big disconnect there. But I think that people have been shocked. I certainly had, when I wrote my memoir, this time next year we'll be laughing. We can only hope. It's, I had so many messages from people saying, I didn't know, didn't realize that rationing, post-World War II rationing didn't end until 1954, and then there were still shortages thereafter, and
life was much harder there than it was here.
It was
obviously.
very hard.
But I also learned most from movies. I believe that when British prisoners of war walked into a Japanese prison camp, they were whistling Colonel Bogey's March as they did in Bridge on the River.
Well, people also sung their way through the First World War and the Second World War. You got to keep. It's such a. How can I say? The life went from one extreme to the other. There was people went out to seeking fun in wartime. I mean, there was a place called Rainbow Corner near Piccadilly Circus. It's where American troops went, for some R&R to go to, and they had dancing. Everybody had a great time, and but at the same time, I can remember my aunt telling me about leaving work in a factory. What would she have been, 16? They had to leave because there was a daytime bombing raid. And I put this in one of the books because it was such a horrific scene, that she said she walked past this where houses had come down, and she saw this woman trying to be, the ARP, the Air Raid Patrol people were trying to comfort her, the police were there. She is grabbling on her hands and knees, which are bleeding, saying, my girls, my girls, my girls. Her daughters were under that house. And then my mum saw her father, my aunt saw her father and my mother walking towards her because they had gone out to look for her because they were so worried. And it's seeing things like that. And so, when I think of the story that my mum told about being buried under rubble, and then they went out in the evening,
and you have Maisie as an ambulance driver in horrific scenes of fires and buildings collapsing and her friend seriously injured. Yes. Brave people. The Blitz, 1940.
Yes.
Germany is bombing London every night,
And often during the day.
and often during the
And
day.
it was a very specific type of.
I'm going far afield here. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to help the Brits
Yeah.
and had the hardest time getting Lend-Lease through Congress. Why? What's your,
Actually,
why did we not come willingly, quickly, freely, trying to give old destroyers, old rust bucket ships to Great Britain? And I believe there were opinion polls at the time that showed it was mildly unpopular, more than 50%.
There were several reasons. Number one, America didn't want to get involved in another European war. And you just asked the question about, Americans and sort of being understanding what happens in different wars. And it's really interesting to me. Here's an example that in the First World War, 126,000 American men were killed. Now, a purist would say, well, a lot of them went down with the flu. Well, that happens in every conflict. There's people that die of something that is nothing to do with the conflict. So basically, America lost double the men than she lost in Vietnam. And yet, no one really talks about all those men that died in the First World War, but we hear a lot about Vietnam. But so that anyway, there was a great feeling we don't want to get involved in another American war. There was a very strong America first. 1939, Madison Square Garden, the swastikas were hanging up. There was also a great feeling there were so many German immigrants in the United States that we didn't want to upset those either. And but actually, Britain didn't pay off its war debt until 2006 to the United States. So we paid our debts.
We should have forgiven it.
But yes, it was a problem, which is, I think, why, and who knows, but why there's always been this controversy is that, was Pearl Harbor left, sort of, was there something there that was not deliberate, but, there's this, you've heard the controversy that it was vulnerable.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, there are some people who think that Roosevelt knew we were going to be attacked, and that was the way to get us into the war.
Yeah.
It's a little bit murky.
It's a bit iffy.
I believe it was William Randolph Hearst who came up with America First and put it up on the ear of one of his newspapers, or all of his newspapers. Then it was picked up by Charles Lindbergh. It's picked up by Henry Ford, who was sort of the Elon Musk of the pre-World War II days.
Yeah.
And we've heard America First today, haven't we? Yes. Okay. Can't go there. You had this epiphany, this moment of artistic grace that created Maisie. What happened that you're bringing her to a close? Was there another moment?
Well, there was a moment, and the moment happened pretty soon after that. When I wrote Maisie Dobbs, and half of it when I was recovering from an accident, actually, and then my editor called to tell me the day that the manuscript had gone into production. So basically, off it went, and I had a job to do. So, and I thought I'd just written a novel. I didn't even, I'd written this war story, a coming of age story, and it was a mishmash. It has underpinned by the mystery. And she called me and she said, now let's talk about the next book in the series. And I thought,
What's
right.
the series?
Right. And I actually pretended there was someone at the door. And I said, I'll call you back later, but there's somebody at the door. And I got out of that and I thought, whoa. But while I was writing Maisie Dobbs, there were scenes, names of people, that were coming to me that I had written, but I pulled out. And because I come from a long line of people that never throws anything out because it might come in handy one day, I was putting all these pages into a file marked fragments. It's something I still do. Printed off every page, put them across the floor, started moving them around, and realized I had the kindling, not the fuel, not the spark, just the kindling for more books and more stories with Maisie Dobbs. And that's when I thought, okay, Jackie, sit down. What do you want to create here? And I realized, okay, if I've got a series, I want to move it through time. What did I want to do in that series? I wanted to find out how people grow and change and impact against a backdrop of being impacted by the events of their day. And we all know we are impacted personally by the events of our day. And I wanted to know how they operated within their families and how they carried their wounds. I wanted to know all these things, and I also wanted to, as I say, take it through time, and I didn't know how far I'd get. I thought I might get to just before the Second World War, but I knew that if I could get as far as the Second World War, I would end it in 1945. And I wanted there to be an arc of the series, just as there's an arc of each story. I had no idea whether I'd be able to pull it off. And every time, I was asked for the next book, I thought, well, I'm going to be writing another one now, or another two now. So I could go a bit further on my arc.
But you took on something way more difficult than most of the series mystery crime fiction characters. I don't think Philip Marlowe aged. He'd get hit over the head with a sap and be knocked unconscious, and then he'd go on, and same thing in the next tale. I don't think that, I could be wrong, I don't think John D. MacDonald's character Travis McGee aged. Jack Reacher doesn't age.
No.
He's still 6'5", 250 pounds. So not only did you have to take her through time, age her, give her all of these different attributes and difficulties, you had to know what happened in each of those eras. So I'm going to suggest to you that you may have ended at 1945. It was only 5 years later Korea happened, and Great Britain was in Korea. Should we bring Maisie back?
Yes.
Yeah, you could.
Would you like to take some questions?
Yeah.
Sure. Let's take some
'Cause
questions. You can be the MD.
Yeah, why don't you?
I want to just agree with the fact that we are so naive. We have no idea what war is like, and your book really helped me to see that it resonated with everybody. Everybody was affected by the war, and not just when it happened, but it continued to happen. So you really accomplished what you set out to be, I think.
Thank you
And
very
the other
much.
thing I want to say is how I trusted your history, that what you said happened at that time, because it's so many books, they kind of exaggerate it or they change it so that it goes with their character, and you really had the character work within the history, the historical period that they were living in, and I thank you for that. I really learned a lot.
Thank you very much. You wouldn't believe the number of people that told me that, well, smog wasn't used in those days, and I'm sorry, it wasn't invented in LA in the 1970s. In 1904,
The wood fires, the
wood
chimneys,
fires,
the
and
coal,
it's
everything.
I use that as an example that you're constantly, if you're trying to be true to the time, checking things. That if you're going to put a Band-Aid on someone, they better have been invented.
Yeah.
Or you better have a good reason why the guy's got a Band-Aid, which I had to do in one of the books. Yeah.
I just first of all want to say appreciation of how much the books have meant to me. I read them all from September to December last year.
Wow.
Whoa.
Discovering them and waiting the last 6 months for your final one, as well as your other books. And one of my great loves of your books is how you treat Maisie, what an amazing person she is, and whether she's going to have a happy ending or a sad ending. There were times you made decisions that I had to walk away. I was so upset. And you surrounded her with this wonderful cast of characters who were like family and became like family to me. And I so appreciate, because I've read the last book, without spoilers, that there's still, we hear from them. And that meant a lot to me, that you had all those characters. So when you said you were planning your book and you took her through, you were going to take her through how life impacted her, was it your intention then to give her that family of all the people in her life, from her mentor to Billy, all of the people that Priscilla, everyone that she meet?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it was only when I was writing my memoir that I realized how there was one conversation in my life that I hadn't even realized how much it had impacted not only my work but my life, but particularly the character of Maisie Dobbs and other characters that she's close to. And although I didn't actually, I wish I'd put this conversation in the book, in my memoir, but I didn't. And I'll, if I may. But when I was a kid, if you read my memoir, my mum worked on a farm. She did farm work, because if you're in a rural area, that's something you can do and take kids with you. But by the time I was 11, you know, I mean, she was a very fiercely intelligent woman, so she was, right, now what can I do? And when I was about 15, she landed a job at a local boys detention centre. And she was able to land that job because she just passed a driving test and she got a car, you know, got an old car. So these places are never on a bus route. They are way out in the country. So if people abscond, you can find them pretty darn quickly. A detention centre in those days, so we're going back to circa 1970, was an institution, effectively a prison for young offenders, males, 16 to 21. They were not first-time offenders. They were, but they didn't want to put them into a prison where they'd, you know, with the hard nuts, where they'd really learn how to be criminals. They were on 3 to 6 month sentences, as I said, and you know, they weren't first-time offenders because first-time offenders get probation. So my mum worked her way up very quickly from being basic admin assistant, and pretty soon, within about 4 or 5 years, and it was a government position under Home Office prisons, she was the chief administrative officer, and she had a stellar career within the department. However, I was home from college one day, and I was up in London and came home on a Friday, and my mum came home from work and she looked particularly weary, and I made a cup of tea and we sat at the table, and I just said, "Mum, what happens to these boys?" I said, "They're my age. How do they end up in a place like that? What happens to them?" And she looked at once very sad. And I will add, she had quite a lot of, she wasn't disciplinary, that was not her job. She was purely administrative, but she had a lot of communication with the lads. And she looked very sad and she said, "You know what it is, Jackie? Because someone, somewhere along the line, didn't care enough. Because someone, somewhere along the line, didn't care enough." And I realized when I recalled that conversation that had underpinned my writing. That Maisie Dobbs, in the first book, when she lays her hand against the heart of a murderer, she cares enough. She cares enough to look for the victim in the villain. And that sometimes there is a villain in a victim. That it's not just, you know, who did this and who did that. And that she has people with her, the people she draws to her are people that care enough. Whether it's her friend Priscilla, whether it's Billy Beale, you know, Maurice Blanche, there is a caring enough. And I think that might answer your question.
Well,
you know?
I'm going to underline it, that Maisie possesses an empathy that you demonstrated just now. that is Jackie as Maisie. And your question makes me think, Maisie's real to you.
Oh, yeah.
Everything you said,
I
Maisie
feel like
is
I've
real.
seen all the books in a movie form.
Well, isn't it
Thank
something that fiction, well done, can create characters that are as real as your next door neighbors?
I could tell you a really scary story about that someone told me once.
Go ahead. Sure.
It was
sure.
this woman that I met on a business course, and she was, you know, she had this executive career, but she had another job. She was a what they call a registered medium, and she worked with police departments, you know, finding things, sometimes things you didn't want to find. And she told me that, and it was just in a conversation, and I think it was before I even began writing Maisie Dobbs. She told me that at one point, one of her friends had written quite a lot of short stories and written a novel, and said to her, "Would you read my novel for me?" And she said, "Oh, sure, I will." And she said it was only when she started reading a raw manuscript, not a book, but the raw manuscript. This is going to be spooky. She said she realized that becoming a character in a story was another means of incarnation. And at that point I went, whoa, really? But you know, we've got to get off now. I wasn't in that mood. You know.
Time for one more, one more question, and if not, yes.
I just wondered how you keep all the facts straight. All those years of Maisie and how many things and people and I don't know, how do you keep a timeline or?
You know what, in fact, sometimes I know I've slipped up here and there, but it's just like, how do we keep people in our head, you know, that we know all our relatives and we know what happens and we know what happens to our friends, and we might forget a name or two here, you know, a name or two here and there, or even a name or five here and there, but I don't keep extensive notes, but how can I say this? I have been so immersed in that era that there's stuff that you learn along the way that you just know. And the other thing for me, I think when I look back on it, I think this was a really crucial part of my foundation as a writer, the writer that I became, was that when I was a kid, I lived in a very rural area. It was basically me, my baby brother, and of course if you're 4 years old, your baby brother doesn't really count, and the old people. And I was one of these children that someone only had to say, well, in my day, and boom, I was there in their day. And in fact, someone said to me, it was my literary agent, asked me a couple of years ago, she said, do you think of yourself as a child of the 50s or the 60s? And I said, well, to tell you the truth, until I was 14, I was an Edwardian child, because that was the childhood of most of the people who were in this very small community. And in fact, my parents, you know, when they left that house 25 years later, and both my brother and I had well left home at that point, they was being known by a lot of people as the young couple at the end. They were not young. You know, it was that. So there was that foundation of understanding, and also I would add very much that understanding of the women of the generation that I have written about, and that Maisie is part of, because in our street and also around the corner there were about 4 ladies who had missed this, missed that, and missed the other, ladies of a certain age for whom there had never been a husband and children. And I would be invited round to tea, a little girl being invited round to tea, because, you know, they were, you know, these women knew how to bring children into their lives. Not one had a cat. There were a few very big dogs, I might add. But, you know, for every single one of those women, there was a sepia photograph of a young man lost to war. And that stays with you. So when you ask me about, you know, keeping everything in my head, I think a lot of it has always been in my head.
And in your DNA.
Yeah, in my DNA.
On behalf of everybody here, thank you for 21 years of Maisie Dobbs.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. That was one of the best interviews I've ever had.